I have held the same philosophy and now hold for as far back as I can remember. I have learned a great deal through the years and extended my knowledge of details, of specific issues, of definitions, of applications, and I intend to continue expanding it, but I have never had to change any of my fundamentals. My philosophy, in essence, is the concept of man as a heroic being with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life, with productive achievement as his noblest activity, and reason as his only absolute.
University of Michigan Television presents an interview with a challenging critic of intellectual life and leadership in America today. An interview with Ayn Rand, noted American novelist, author of The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, and philosopher spokesman for America's new intellectuals. To interview Ms. Rand, Professor James McConnell of the Department of Psychology at the University of Michigan.
Ms. Rand, a moment ago we heard you mention the fundamentals of your philosophy of life. I suppose it's true that, at least in one sense, every novelist is a philosopher. But I think very few novelists have devoted the time and the energy that you have to the development of a consistent philosophical system. So let me begin by asking you, do you consider yourself primarily a novelist or primarily a philosopher?
I would say I'm primarily both equally and for the same reasons. You see, my main interest and purpose, both in literature and in philosophy, is to define and present the image of an ideal man, the specific, concrete image of what man can be and ought to be. And when I started writing, when I approached the task of literature and began to study philosophy, I discovered that I was in profound disagreement with all the existing philosophies, particularly their codes of morality. Therefore, I had to do my own thinking. I had to define my own full philosophical system in order to discover and present the kind of ideas and premises that make an ideal man possible, in order to define what kind of convictions would result in the character of an ideal man.
I think your novels show very clearly that you have achieved that sort of fusion of philosophy and fiction that I think you aimed for.
Thank you.
You know, in several of your novels, you've made the point that leadership in any culture, not only in art, but in literature, morality, politics, and economics, that this sort of leadership must be provided by what you call the professional intellectuals. I wonder if you could tell me just what you mean by the term professional intellectuals. Who are they, for example?
The professional intellectuals are, in effect, the field agents of the army whose head or commander-in-chief is the philosopher.
Mm-hmm.
The philosopher, the man who defines the basic fundamental ideas of a culture, is the man who determines history. And professional intellectuals are all those whose professions deal with the humanities, the studies of men as against the physical sciences. The professional intellectuals in all their various professions carry to the rest of the culture, to the rest of society, the philosophical premises, the ideas which have been defined by the philosopher. Therefore, they are the transmission belts. They are the ones who determine the goals, the values, and the direction of a culture.
Is this true in any culture? Would it be true no matter where you found them?
It is true in any civilized culture, but historically you must remember this. The new intellectual, or rather the intellectual, is a very recent phenomenon. There were no such phenomenon as a professional intellectual prior to the Industrial Revolution and the birth of capitalism. Prior to that, man could not make a living, could not make a profession of intellectual work. The mind, the intellect, reason, had no value in those earlier cultures. It is only since the birth of capitalism and of a free society that man, for the first time in history, acquired the chance to make a living by means of dealing with ideas. Reason became a practical issue for the first time. And the height of it was the 19th century. Today, this is the value which we are losing, and it is the intellectuals who are betraying it.
You think then that America's intellectual leadership has collapsed?
Yes, collapsed and abdicated.
Oh, how have the intellectuals failed to do the things that they ought to do? How have they not lived up to their responsibilities?
By betraying the very premise that made their existence possible, by denying the intellect. For decades now, the intellectuals have been progressively preaching and advocating the idea that the intellect is impotent, that man can know nothing for certain, that reason is unreliable, and in effect man has no power to know the facts of reality. This amounts to men who, proclaiming themselves intellectual, spend their time denying the validity of the intellect. That is a form of committing suicide. And today, when you see the rise of such openly mystical, anti-intellectual philosophies as Zen Buddhism or existentialism, doctrines which cannot really properly be called philosophies, this is the admission of intellectual bankruptcy on the part of those who accept it. If in a group of men, such a theory as Zen Buddhism, which is a doctrine originating about the 5th century BC, if that becomes the latest word of the mind, it isn't I who am condemning them. They have condemned themselves by their own actions. They have given up. They have declared their intellectual bankruptcy and have gone back to the mysticism of the Dark Ages.
Why do you think they've done this?
Because since philosophers are the ones who really set the basic premises of the whole intellectual profession, the philosophies of the Western world have been going progressively more and more towards mysticism ever since the Renaissance. The Renaissance was the intellectual result of the Aristotelian influence, the influence of Aristotle's philosophy, which in effect destroyed the Middle Ages and broke the way for the Renaissance. But ever since then, while the culture in general, were achieving incredible progress, culminating in the 19th century, on the basis of that Aristotelian influence, the intellectuals, ever since Immanuel Kant, were going progressively more and more against reason. The trend started, of course, before Kant, but I consider Kant the crucial destroyer and the crucial turning point. He was the philosopher who undercut the validity of reason. He did not really succeed, but his is the most skillful system of pushing reason off the philosophical scene altogether. And to the extent to which other philosophers and intellectuals accepted his basic premises, to that extent they have been moving towards a noumenal, mystical world ever since.